There's a section that you're going to be studying in this particular study of calculation for oil and gas interest, and it's going to be dealing with how to calculate that royalty interest, or that interest that's going to the mineral owners in the producing well. If you look at the title here on the screen, what it says is that numbers tell a story. You know, the truth is that not everybody is wired to where they understand math, or math comes easily to them. Some people are, but a lot of people aren't. But I believe this. I believe that most of us can look at pictures, and those pictures can tell a story. I think that's true with math as well. You see, if we have a particular mineral owner or a royalty owner and we see his calculation, all it is simply numbers. But every one of those numbers tell a part of the story of that mineral owner, that royalty owner. So if we can see the pictures in the numbers, we can tell their story. And that's kind of the methodology that I'm going to use in this particular video clip. I want you to look at the picture. This is a fictitious mineral owner we're going to calculate his interest. His name is Frank Tillman. We're going to tell his story with numbers. What I tried to do in this slide is create a slide that was kind of etched in stone, something that's so true that it's hard to erase. I'm just going to read this, but follow along and really understand the heart and soul of what this is saying. It says that calculating interests for oil and gas properties will almost always begin with the amount of acres that a person either owns or is contributing to a tract of land or a unit area. You know what? The land professional, we're not accountants. We don't count dollars. We're land people. We count acres. And every interest that we calculate in almost every case is going to begin with acres. Now, the good thing for many of us, depending on where we work in the United States, is that when the United States was first surveyed after the Revolutionary War, the survey was done setting tracts of land into the size of a square or a rectangle. And in most of the tracts of land across the United States going west, the tracts of land were set up in a 1-mile square block. So if you look at the picture, this is a tract of land. It's called Section 17. And the distance from the north line to the south line is exactly 1 mile. And from the east line to the west line is exactly 1 mile. Now, why that's important for us to know is we know if you have a mile square tract of land in Indiana or Kansas or Pennsylvania, we know exactly how many acres are in that tract of land. There's 640 acres. And we need to know acres when we calculate oil and gas interests. So let's assume if you see the square that's kind of at the bottom of that picture, that's a section of land. It's a mile square and it contains 640 acres. But let's assume that Frank Tillman doesn't own all of that tract of land. What Frank owns is what's enlarged there. It's called the northeast quarter of that section because it's more in the north and it's more in the east and it's 25% of that section. Can you tell me how many acres Frank is contributing to this well? Well, the nice thing is even the names that were given by the surveyors to these tracts of land can help us do the math. If we know that there's 640 acres, look at the name of that tract, northeast quarter. It tells us how to do the math. We simply take the gross acres, 640, and look at the name again. We divide by 4. In this case, Frank is bringing 160 acres to the table. But let's assume that Frank didn't own that tract of land. Instead, he owned that tract of land. The name of that tract of land is the south half of the southwest quarter. In that case, how many acres is Frank bringing to the table? Well, let's do the math. It's still 640 acre section. Let's divide by 4 and divide by 2. That's what the legal description tells us to do. In this case, Frank is bringing 80 acres to the table. Let's say that that wasn't the tract of land either, but this is the tract of land. It's called the northwest quarter of the northwest quarter. Can you calculate how many acres Frank's bringing to the table? 640 acres divided by 4 and divided by 4. In that case, he's bringing 40 acres to the table. Let's say that's not even the tract, but this is the tract. It's called the northeast quarter of the northeast quarter of the northeast quarter. Let's simply do the math. 640 divided by 4, divided by 4, divided by 4. In that case, Frank owns 10 acres. We're going to start with acres, and we're going to assume that Frank owns a tract of land. We need to calculate his interest, but the oil and gas lease will tell us also how to calculate Frank's interest, and there's 3 pieces to the oil and gas lease, or clauses in the oil and gas lease, that will help us calculate Frank's interest. First, we determine how many acres. We then need to look at the pooling clause in the lease, the royalty clause in the lease, and in many cases, we're going to need to look at what's called the proportion reduction clause in the lease. We'll look at each of these separately. This is just a portion of the pooling clause, but what the pooling clause is saying is this, that the tract of land that Frank owns may not be large enough for a company to drill a well. We need not only Frank's tract of land, but we need the neighboring tracts of land around it, and we need to kind of like pool them together so that we have enough acreage to drill the well. I'm going to read the pooling clause, and here's what I want you to do. I want you to try to digest what it's saying, but also I want you to count how many times the word acreage is used. You see, acres is really a big thing when we calculate interest for these people. Here's what the pooling clause says. In respect to production from the unit, the lessee, that's the oil company, shall pay the lessor, that's Frank. So the oil company shall pay Frank in lieu of other royalties that are set out on the lease, only such proportion of the royalty stipulated herein as the amount of Frank's acreage that's placed in the unit, or his royalty interest thereon on an acreage basis as the acres he's contributing bears to the total acres in the unit. You know what that's really saying? Let me just put it in these words. Frank's just going to get his proportionate part of the unit. And it's going to be based on the number of acres he's bringing to the total number of acres in the pool of acres that's needed. So let's assume that this is Frank's tract of land. It's the northeast quarter. Remember how many acres he owns? He owns 160 acres. Here's how we're going to do the math to give him his proportionate part of all of the pooled acres. He's bringing 160 acres, and if we add up all of the acres in that pooled area, that totals 640. Frank's proportionate part is 0.25 or 25%. 0.25 is the decimal form of 25%. But remember this, I said that there were 3 clauses in the oil and gas lease that's going to help us calculate his interest. We need to look at this clause, which is the royalty clause. And what the royalty clause will do is it will set out the fractional part of production that Frank has agreed to receive. He's not going to get all of the production. The oil company wouldn't be able to make money. He's only going to get the piece of production or the fractional piece of production he's negotiated. And in this particular case, let's assume that Frank agreed to only receive 12.5% or 1/8 of all production. 1/8 is 12.5%. The way you come up with that is you take 1 and divide it by 8. 1/8 is 0.125. So let's continue Frank's calculation. Frank is bringing 160 acres to a total pool of 640 acres, and he said, and all I want is 0.125 or 12.5% of all production. At this point, that's his calculation. But what I said was that there's 3 clauses in the oil and gas lease, and this next clause is critical for the oil and gas company if in fact Frank doesn't own 100% of the minerals under that 160 acres. Let's assume this, that sometime in the past, Frank sold an undivided 50% of the minerals under that 160 acre tract of land to another person. We'll call him Ivan Tommy. So Frank only owns 50% of the minerals. Ivan owns 50% of the minerals. When the oil company leased Frank, they only leased 50% of the minerals under that 160 acre tract of land. This is the proportion reduction clause. It's critical for the oil company, and what it says is this: if the lessor, Frank, owns a less interest in the above described land than the entire undivided fee simple estate, then the royalties or the rentals provided shall be paid to the lessor only in the proportion which his interest bears to the whole undivided fee in the tract. All that's saying is his interest is going to be based on the 50% of the minerals that he owns. Here's how we're going to end up calculating Frank's interest. He's bringing 160 acres. It's been pooled together with other leases that total 640 acres. He only owns 50% of the minerals under that tract. He agreed to only receive 12.5% of the production, so his interest out of all production from that well is going to be 0.015625.